We're really delighted and privileged to have Henry Warde here. So, Squerryes Court, which I expect you all have heard of, and really what Henry's going to do is talk about the business and also what it takes to continue running a business in a modern age with a business with such a legacy and such a heritage. And it's not easy, you know, because you have to move with the times, but you have to hold on to all the things that you hold dear and that have given you that legacy to start with. So without further ado, Henry, come and talk to us about your family business. Please, a warm welcome to Henry. Thank you very
much. To you both. And yeah, for the next 15 minutes or so, I just want to tell you the story about Squerryes Estate. We're based around Westerham, so if you, from Bromley, if you go down through Biggin Hill, there's the what used to be the Spinning Wheel pub, which is now the Champagne Curry House, if you know it, and you go down the valley into the North Downs, and you see Westerham in front of you. That is the start of the Squerryes Estate, and we go down to Chartwell, south of Westerham. The history is that my 8 generations ago, great, bought Squerryes. He was a successful trader in the city. He traded in cloth. It was a 3rd generational family business, and he wanted a place to live. So it's a bit like a oligarch buying a yacht today. It's a trophy asset. And then the next generation, next 2 generations spent quite a lot of wealth. So they were 4th generation. I think probably the stat was that they got a bit lazy then, and they started spending the money. 7 generations ago, fortunately for us, they spent the money on a fabulous art collection in the 1750s and 1760s, the majority of which are still in the house today. And then his son invented fox hunting. So he went around the country basically with his hounds, partying the whole of his life, introducing fox hunting to the whole of England, which is a great legacy, unless it depends where you stand on the issue. But he spent an awful lot of the money, and then there were I suppose were about 3 generations who were sort of countrymen, gentry, slightly living the quiet life. Well, apart from they were admirals and generals and colonels, and they did all that sort of thing. And the money really ran out after the Second World War. So, you know, for you good folk, Downton Abbey, wasn't it fantastic? For us, it was just, wow, this is our family history. You know, ill-fated investments in railways through to the First World War, meaning that all the staff left, etc. And my grandfather he had 2 bits of luck. The first is that they found sand just outside Westerham, and that kept the family going in a manner that it was accustomed, which actually was not very grand at that point for a generation. Secondly, he married my grandmother, who was a real firebrand of a woman. She represented British women for the UN. She next door neighbour didn't get on with that dreadful man Winston Churchill at all, and gave her a run for his money. And she was a firm conservative. She thought that she was a liberal. And the first thing she did in 1947 was to demolish the wings before planning. And basically, my grandparents hunkered down. And when my father took on the estate in 1963, as a very young man, he was at Cambridge. His vision was to be the first generation for 7 generations then who really was going to work, because he needed to. And his vision was to take the farms, there were 7 farms, in hand. He took his first farm tenancy on Michaelmas Day in 1963. He wanted to farm so that he could sustain the estate and also educate his children. And he retired from farming 50 years to the day, Michaelmas Day 2013, having done exactly that. Where we are today, I took over in just a couple of years ago, really. We moved into the house. I've got a small family, but a big small family. I've got 4 children between 8 and 2. So they're sort of slowly trashing the house as we go from room to room. But he left a great legacy, and that legacy was that on the estate, the 2,500 acres, we now have a residential portfolio of properties, a commercial portfolio of properties. We've got about 10 to 15 businesses who rent old agricultural buildings. We've got a dairy enterprise, a dairy farm. We've got an arable enterprise. And as he brought in all of the farms, there was a central farm, and it left the farmhouse and the farm cottages from the old traditional farms and the traditional farm buildings, which he then invested for a lifetime. And we're taking on from that base. So that's where we are now. We have property interests in around Westerham. We have a farm. We're growers. And in 2006, we planted a vineyard. Reason for that was that I was on my honeymoon. Dad called in, or I called him, I can't remember, and he said, "Oh, there's some French people visiting. They want to come and visit." It happened to be a champagne house called the Valois, and they were looking at the difficulties in champagnes in some hot years to produce traditional champagne. Champagne is the coolest area of France where you can grow grapes to get the acidity and the cleanness in the champagne product. And it was just getting too hot, particularly in 2003. So they looked further north, and they found the bit of what they call terroir, a bit of ground, which is chalk, which is the most similar to champagne. So the White Cliffs of Dover, North Downs goes across to there, and then it pops up again in Epinay, which is in Champagne. So they came and they wanted to buy the land. We said, well, we've owned it for so long, we don't want to sell it. And we had this sort of extraordinary negotiation. I'm not sure if we ever negotiated with a French company. It's an extraordinary thing. They found us extraordinary and they walked away. But then 2 years later, we planted the vines. And we are now, you're going to be tasting a bit of 2011, which we've been selling locally, but we just got a contract with Waitrose. In terms of, I just want to talk a bit about succession and the way that we've managed things through generations. So a bit unlike your example, which was the family business not surviving. Remember that my family's pretty idle for 6 generations. And actually that's not quite true. My grandmother was certainly not idle, so maybe for 3 generations. But successional planning is like the first thing I'm thinking about for the next generation and the next 2 or 3 generations. The way that my grandparents did it was pure luck. My grandfather happened to die in the 3-week window before death duty was brought in. We're one of 3 families who benefited from, I think it was Dennis Healy's sort of kind of there was a point in the 70s there. My father's in the 70s, what he did was he formed complicated offshore trusts, put land and buildings into ownerships and got a network of trusts, which have broadly spoken sort of worked. And now there's a bit of flexibility. I'm the beneficiary, even though I'm one of 3 siblings. There is this principle in our family that actually, in order for it to survive, one person gets the asset, and I'm second son, so that's quite controversial. Well, it wasn't in my older brother's an artist who just said, I'm just not, having seen how hard my parents worked, he said, I'm just not up for it. So my father did successional planning through trusts. And I'm scratching my head and thinking, okay, right, how am I going to ensure that one of my children take on the estate? And actually, nowadays, trusts, and particularly Panama, just simply, I think, are politically dead. But the one thing, and when we're thinking about this sort of thing, we need to think sort of to 20, 30, 40 years, hopefully. The bus may get me first, particularly through Bromley. It's very busy there. But I think the key to it, from my perspective, is that rather than sort of making it difficult and complicated actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring the estate together into one very, very simple partnership. There are 5 partners, my father, my mother, myself, my wife, and a corporate entity that does quite a lot of management, has contracts in London, all sorts of things. But we're trying to bring it to one partnership because, in my view, the governments, the one politically untouchable wealth creators in this country are family businesses, in my view. So the 30% of GDP comes from family businesses. And I think it will continue to be like that because the deficit is going to continue for the next 30, 40 years, 50 years, probably forever. We're in such a state as this country. So what we're doing is we're relying on BPR relief, business property relief, which is quite difficult. So if you imagine the estate is, because of that legacy, is worth some tens of millions of pounds. When you add on all the bolts-ons of the art and all that sort of thing. And the idea is to bring everything into a partnership, a trading partnership, that can trade and can pass through the generations as a trading business. So the whole notion that anybody with wealth, in my view, can just sit with wealth and sort of kind of structure their way out of inheritance tax is just pure folly. I think that's my view. So what that means for us is that I'm an accountant, so we're starting to think in terms of EBITDA and cash flows. So what we have a certain amount of cash flows from our investment property assets, which in terms of inheritance tax is the bad stuff on the naughty step. And then there is the cash flows from the trading business. Now I'm going to get on to the wine, which we're going to drink in a minute, because that's a key part of it. And what just as my father for 30 or 40 or 50 years, was focusing on the farming, I think my legacy, which I'm keen to create for my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, is focusing on the wine, because it is such an enormous opportunity, English wine just at the moment. I think in 20 or 30 years, England and Champagne will be at a par in international reputation terms. I think in 30 or 40 years, England will be above Champagne because of climate change, internationally. That is how big the opportunity, I think, is for brands to develop. So as we develop the brands and as we invest in the brands, essentially the cash flows generated from that business go into the milkshake so that the whole of the estate is a trading asset and a trading entity. Now that makes sense from the perspective, and you'll see in your bags that you've got a kind of thing about membership, which I love you to look at. Taste the wine if you think it's any good. Sign up, become a member. It's a sort of like local group where people come to the house, come to the estate, buy the wine, etc. But the branding is all about bringing in the kind of 300 years of history into the brand itself. That's how confident we are in our own product. And the house, which is, I'm not sure if you've driven along the A25, you caught a glimpse of it, but it's where Jane Austen was filmed. It was Emma's house in the Jane Austen BBC adaptation. So it's a really wonderful thing to get that family history and that family heritage right bang central, to bring the whole thing together. And that's the strategy. Otherwise, what happens in our scenario is you get an asset where 40% of it goes next generation, and it gets whistled down, and you get to a critical, there just needs to be a critical mass to keep the house going, basically, with the cash flows. So that is the vision, that's the plan. I hope that has been useful in the context of what we're talking about, and thank you very much.